Welcome to the Productivity Power Hour. Hey, Ron, how are you?
Good, Don. How are you?
I'm doing well, and I'm excited for today's topic. In talking a little bit about high performing teams. Yeah, very interested to hear what your thoughts are as well with that as well.
Yeah, I mean, you know me, I've got opinions on everything, and I have strong opinions on high performing teams and cultures. So happy to share.
Yeah. So maybe we start with when you look at a high performing team. What are some of the things that you see in high performing teams?
So I think the number one thing with high performing teams is communication. These teams have the ability to communicate and quickly, right? And it's not just about the technical ability to communicate via verbally or through tools. It's more around what we're communicating, how often we're communicating, and how that drives performance. Really great teams have clearly their leaders have clearly communicated their vision, their strategy. They've translated that into a clear message about what the objectives are, what the expectations of that team are, what good looks like as far as performance. Highly effective teams and high performing teams really understand, whether they're a piece in the cog or whether they're much bigger, what their responsibility is overall to unlock that vision or that strategy. And it's clear. So if you ask one teammate and say, hey, what's the purpose of this team? What's the mission of this team? What's the overall strategy? You're going to get the same answer from everybody. You ask them, what does good look like as far as performance? What are your top problems? Everybody's sort of saying the same thing. Low performing teams, they'll all say something different. And ultimately, it's because of a lack of communication. So that's kind of, what I see is the number one uh, uh, influencer on a high performing team. What do you think, Don?
Yeah, I agree with that. I feel like um, like, similar to, players on a team, in sports or, you think about, the fingers on your hand, one can't operate, without the other sort of noticing, right? And um, I also feel like, aside from the communication, standpoint of it, the benefit of a high performing team is that the velocity that comes out of that team is far above what you see from even mediocre teams. I mean, mediocre teams that, aren't communicating, the ground rules aren't clear to them, the role that they play isn't clear. All of these things become things that sort of hold them back. And, they, to become that high performing team, you more or less have to have those transparent routes of communication, but you also need a firm understanding in terms of like the levels of um, communication to the point that people aren't competing amongst the team, right? I mean, what's funny to me is even whenever you hear people sort of rewind the clock on the Bulls with Michael Jordan, or look at any of the high performing basketball or football teams that you've seen, one of the things that has to be clear amongst that team at some level is the role that everybody plays across the team. And so whenever, one player now comes out and wants to rewind history or, wants to sort of, say that they were the superstar, the reality is without the rest of the fingers on the hand, the one player is really would be, one player getting sacked a lot in football, or one player sort of, getting the ball taken away from them a lot in basketball. So
Yeah, no, I agree. I love the analogy to sports. I mean, this starts getting into things like racy, and just those clear delineation of roles and responsibilities where everybody knows what part they're playing. I had a friend that once said, and I love this analogy. He's like, think of this team or this organization as a play, and
mm,
everybody is cast in a certain role, and there's a particular role that is for that organization or that play to be successful. You can't have two people playing the same role. Otherwise, you're not going to have a good play. And to your point with sports, especially basketball, I like the Jordan analogy because it really is true. Guys like Scottie Pippen, Dennis Rodman, they played key roles on that team. They knew what those roles were, and even to the owner, to the coach, everybody played a particular role. And if you look at other sort of teams that maybe didn't have that, so I go back to LeBron James. LeBron and I are about the same age. We went to high school in the same region, so I watched LeBron play when he was in high school. So I've always kind of had a little bit of a connection, to him, and have watched him over the years. And really, the first part of his career, you know, the Cleveland Cavaliers never built good teams. They just had LeBron. They never really considered how do you build a good team that can compete, with the Celtics, with the Mavericks at the time, and other teams like that. It was sort of all just on one guy's shoulders, and that's why they were never really able to even get close to vying for a championship. And it wasn't until LeBron went to the Heat, where he had Dwayne Wade and some other stars that played key roles, and they were able to put together, a customized team that just won championships over and over. So I love the sports analogy, but I think it gets lost on professionals and leaders in business. And you've had this happen. Leaders will kind of gripe to you about their teams and things like that, and you kind of go, maybe you ought to take a step back and look to see, do you have the right people? Have you communicated with them the right things? Is everybody playing, has the right role or is cast in the right role for this play? And oftentimes, just being around those teams, just a few meetings, you can see where there's people, like you said, competing, they're doing the same thing, or there's not clear communication, and ultimately that team isn't going to perform. So you can look at dashboards all day, you can have governance sessions, you can go to the board and say this, that, and the other thing, but you're not going to get anything fixed if the roles in the team are not right. You're going to end up, with your one superstar trying to carry everybody through, and ultimately you're not going to make it.
Yeah, I do feel like I feel like there's so many analogies that I could tie back to sports as well in terms of offense and defense, as well, that typical teams have this dynamic where you are playing offense and defense many times with the same players. And the reality is, as you look at, let's just take an entire organization. And I actually posted on this not too long ago as well, that it's my belief that whenever you look at a broader organization, let's say you're looking at marketing and sales and things like that, those are your offensive players. They are truly placed on the field to be offensive players. They still need a very strong, quarterback, and in this case could be the CEO, also could be, a very strong commercial leader, depending on the size of the organization, because we all know sort of, there's almost like a startup within larger organizations that oftentimes functions, right? You see, you have multiples of these things that are going on. On the other side, you think about many of the things that you and I have done, from our career standpoint. I think of many of those things being defense related, right? They are, much more focused on the operational side of the business, maybe having to do with, analytics and things like that. But you could almost, break down an organization and say, you need to have some form of a mindset, to your point, of where do different players play, and then where are kind of the fringes of that, and where's the next handoff, right? Because that typically is where everything falls apart. And certainly, if I don't see you doing something, or if you don't see me doing something, one of us could actually, start to play in the other's area just as easily. And I feel like that's normally where, a lot of these things start to fall apart, is that, all of a sudden you're crossing lines, and maybe the other person gets offended, or it thinks it's a challenge in the way that they're working as well.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And actually, it was a few engagements ago. I did a presentation on this. I was building an enterprise project management office for a pretty large company. They're $1 billion company, and ultimately we were doing it with the C-suite. So we had the CEO, CFO, the VP of operations, and those type of folks. And I had to give a presentation to them and to some of their leaders, some of the GMs and things like that. And as we were thinking about this enterprise project management office and what it was going to do, we weren't coming up with the strategy. We weren't the experts on this industry. We were building, a system to execute that strategy, right? Communicate it, uh, do performance management, performance governance. And the way I kind of described it is, this is the blocking and tackling. This is the trench work stuff. We're not the star players in the field. The star players in the field are your skill players, right? Your CEO's the quarterback. He's got the ball. Maybe your CRO, commercial revenue officer, or something like that is a star receiver. You've got other people that are skill players that are on that executive team. But then you have folks like me. It wasn't my job to come in there and, push aside the quarterback and say, hey, I'm going to, come up with this strategy, or, hey, receiver, this is how you do sales. It was my job to help them get those things executed with the resources they have or didn't have. And
Yeah.
that's really what the trench work is about, that operational excellence, that project management. So, as I would talk to some of these folks about what this was and what we were doing, it's very much that trench work. And I think when people understood that, and they understood, the difference between those star players, the roles they played, the role that we played, it just gave everybody a lot of clarity. But relating it back to football, just I think drove the point home that we have a specific role to play here in the trenches. We're blocking and tackling to make this very easy for our star players to get a touchdown.
Yeah.
And the minute we start fighting with our star players for the ball is the minute we're not blocking and tackling. Now we're fighting over the ball, and the quarterback's getting sacked or
Right.
something bad's happening. So yeah, I love that analogy.
Yeah, what was running through my head was special teams when you have the kicker on the field, right? And there still has to be some level of defense to keep everybody away from the kicker, and so you have your offensive line still out there, trying to hold
Yep.
their spot. So yeah, for sure. And
And that's
for
that's a good
anybody,
example of. Oh, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead, Don.
no, 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 go ahead, go ahead.
I was saying that's a good example. I mean, that kicker, while they might not be a quarterback, for that play, they're the star player. And you're going to have certain initiatives that you have to take in a company that, are kind of fringe initiatives, or they're tangential to your main thing, but somebody's going to be leading it. Somebody's going to be that star player, and they still need the same stuff. Like you said, that blocking and tackling, that defensive work to keep them away. Right. So, it's that operational excellence, project management, execution, things like that are really in the trench work. And it doesn't mean that those people aren't celebrated. They certainly are. Offensive linemen do get paid well, but yeah, they're not star players, and they've got to know what their place is. Imagine if you had an offensive lineman, trying to be a receiver
Yeah,
or calling plays, it wouldn't work. So
yeah. All of a sudden somebody could stand up and try and take over another job, and then you'd have real chaos on the field.
yeah,
And
I'm
somebody
telling you.
somebody for sure breaking through because of the fact that you sort of lost the responsibility in that job. And I really want to tie this back overall in terms of the things that you as a leader then can focus on. One is at the very least very basic job descriptions. Like what are those sort of boundaries inside of the job description. It's funny because I've had organizations sort of roll their eyes whenever I talk about the like having processes and systems in place. And typically where I recommend that most organizations start is, where's your biggest problem area? Let's not try and cure everything across the organization. I would say the same exact thing inside of creating job descriptions, right? You don't have to have 100% of the job descriptions for every job tomorrow, but start somewhere. And continue to work on it, right?
Mm.
Make sure that at the end of the day, people, have it. I'll never forget. So one of the recent organizations that I was a full-time employee at, I showed up on site and I started asking people, it's like, do you have a job description? No. I was hired to do something. And one of the people reached up and grabbed a hold of a Post-it note and held it up to me. And they had a few things written down on there. And they said, this is my job description. This is it. I was given this by one of the most senior leaders here, and this is my job description. And I just sort of took that away as a good example of a bad example, I guess.
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, I even take it a step further, and I'll fight and die on this hill with any of my clients. But a job description changes too. So really, what you're looking for is sort of a performance development plan, or a personal development plan, or professional, however you want to say it, a PDP. And that PDP needs to be aligned to what those deliverables are for that person that year. Those deliverables need to be aligned to what that organization strategy and objectives are and how performance is measured. Otherwise, you can have job descriptions are great to have, but they do change. Sometimes you have people in certain positions that one year they're going to be focused on this area, and the next year they're going to be focused on this. So a JD is a great way to help get some organization and some structure. But extra credit, really doing the right thing, is to come up with, hey, this year this is what is expected of you. These are your performance goals, and then we're going to check in monthly or quarterly to give you feedback to see what's changed. Do you need help? Do we need to change something? Did it come from top down, or is it coming from you up? Do we need to give feedback? Something like that. Especially as the millennial generation is getting into their mid 40s, believe it or not. Millennials need to have feedback. It's something with the generation. They need to have it. They need to know, and I'm one of the older millennials. They need to know, and we need to know that our purpose in the company is still good, that we're heading in the right direction. And when you are not following up and having those discussions on performance, and you just come in at the last second, whenever performance isn't good, and say, "Hey, why didn't you do X, Y, Z?" Well, that's a lack of communication. That's why it sort of takes me back to the JD or putting those PDPs in place. They're all forms of communication. So the
Yeah.
more robust that the team can communicate as far as what they're supposed to do, why it benefits them, why it benefits the customer, why it's going to unlock that company strategy, the more that team is going to perform. When you don't have those things, and especially a lack of even a JD, now you're in the Wild West. And even if that person doesn't and let's say they don't perform to your expectations, what do you really have to reprimand them with? Or at that point to say, because you really didn't give them any guidance. So that's sort of how I think about it. And even as I think about some of the tougher discussions, Don, with teams, as far as sometimes your team aren't the right people and you have to make changes. And in order to make changes, you have to communicate, you have to set expectations, right? They have to not follow your expectations. You have to come up with a verbal warning, then a written warning, then you have to put it on performance management, right? And then at that point, you've got enough of a documentation chain. You've done the right thing, which is the right thing to do. And now you can determine if that person needs to be reassigned or exited. But typically, I think leaders get into these low performing team situations where they just don't have communication. They don't have JDs. They don't have performance management plans. And they're stuck just basically in gripe mode with folks like you and I about why their VP or CRO isn't doing X, Y, and Z. Got to have those fundamental things in place.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I'd love to. I mean, one of the things that I've seen a lot of recently, right, is, I mean, there've been a lot of people that are being laid off or let go from different organizations, and I'm seeing a fair amount of HR professionals that are being let go from organizations. And one of the thoughts that always runs through my head is, I mean, I feel like there's an internal politics that oftentimes happens inside of larger organizations, which then very much plays into the way that HR professionals, I feel like, oftentimes manage teams. They manage up more than anybody else, and they'll play the political game more than anybody else. And I've seen There's one particular leader that I have in mind who repeatedly he would hire, let's say, senior directors or VPs directly under him. And within one annual cycle, those same individuals were demoted by one level. And so I mean, this is where I would challenge, any HR professional that's out there as well. You should be looking at the organization also and sort of challenging, wait a minute, how is it that we've hired 10 people and 10 out of 10 have now been demoted within 1 year or let go? There's something to be looked at then whenever you come back to that leader in terms of the way that they lead the organization. But the reality is, I mean, most of the HR organizations that I've dealt with anyway, I mean, they play the game very well in terms of, just sort of not really examining. And I feel like helping leaders maybe examine these things as well themselves, because sometimes, let's just say that it's not the leader himself that was the main issue here. Maybe it's just the way that he learned to lead, and because of his way, his inability to learn a different way, along with the other senior leader that maybe he had that was continually challenging, the team that was being led by this individual, was leading to those continual demotions out of fear that he was going to be the next one, that could be demoted or let go. Right.
Hmm.
So, um, fear does a lot of weird things to people. And I feel like it sort of this all sort of strongly relates back to Patrick Lencioni's, five dysfunctions of a team: the
Yeah.
absence of trust, the fear of conflict, the lack of commitment, the avoidance of team accountability, and the inattention, of team objectives. And all of those things play a direct role. And when you have this dysfunction going on, it can lead to all sort of other ripple effects as well, right? Because you have all the people under this person now looking at everybody else that's been demoted, going, I'm not going to be the next guy, so I'm going to make sure I'm going to make sure that everything that I do shows up as a gold star, and because of that, it's all me, 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 right? Which then again doesn't support the team, and it comes right back to what I feel like we're primarily talking about here.
Yeah, I love the example of Patrick Lencioni's book, Five Dysfunctions of a Team. When I think about that and what you were saying, it's really around having healthy conflict. And if you have healthy conflict, you have trust. So they kind of go hand in hand. That healthy conflict is that HR person is able to step up and say, "Hey, look, we need to look more deeply at this, Mr. or Mrs. CEO, because I think we have a systemic problem in the way that maybe this person has been taught to lead, or that maybe what our hiring practices are, and our teams just aren't functioning." And I think a lot of times it's that executive team that's dysfunctional, right? There isn't that HR presence there that has the trust of that team. To have that healthy conflict and say, "Hey, here's what I think the problem is." So what ends up happening is they just try to solve problems by not solving the root cause. So again, if we're having a high turnover rate, we need to hire more people. That's the number one thing. We got to hire people. Sure, you do when you have turnover, but we got a systemic problem here. And it may be with the people themselves. It may be with our hiring practices. It could be with management. It could be, the environment, the culture. It could be so many things.
Yeah.
And the folks at the top or whatever level in that organization, really have to be functional, trust each other, have that healthy conflict to open up those discussions. Because sometimes, you have to really look inward. Is it me? You have to look in a mirror. Is it me? Is it the way I'm leading? Doesn't mean that I'm going to be fired, but to have that trust in a meeting. Let's say that you are, the COO, so everything operational is under you. In that meeting to say, is the turnover maybe me in the way in which I'm leading? And
Yeah.
I'm happy to take feedback from you guys. And the HR person says, this, and this. And, ultimately you figure out, hey, I have a blind spot. And that's
Right.
great. And now your team they trust you. That you and your transparency, you've solved your blind spot and everybody's better. But when you don't have that trust, like you said, everybody's trying to push blame, and everybody wants to keep their job. Everybody's scared and fearful. So you just suffer from either groupthink or no thinking, and things just don't get done. So yeah, really good reference there for the five dysfunction of the team book.
Yeah, I do think. I mean, just to clarify a little bit. I mean, right? I feel like the HR professionals in organizations can very much be an organizational partner, and that
Mm.
organizational partner could mean that you're reflecting things and sort of saying, hey, wait a minute, let's sort of, you know, go back and take a broader look at, why do we keep having these same situations over and over again. I do agree with you in terms of, we talked about this before in one of these other sessions, that there are seasons, right? There are seasons when you need certain individuals or certain personalities to be involved in an organization. There are some people that are great at that early stage growth, that they really love that. And then there are other people that kind of in the middle play a different role, that sort of help to stabilize the organization and cause less chaos and things like that. And then on the back end, let's just say that there are also times whenever you need more people that have that sort of long-term vision of how things are played. And um and and we cycle through in organizations each of these stages over and over again, as the organization sort of grows and matures, as well. And oftentimes you'll find that either people need to be playing different roles at different times, or they meaning they need to actually change jobs for that, or they need to be able to adapt really well, across. And many of us have, like our primary personality set. One of the organizations that I really don't like being inside of is whenever you're under cost constraint and you're really trying to constrict because of the fact that, something hasn't been achieved. That's not my primary thing that I enjoy. And I know that there are friends of mine as well that love that. They love sort of it gives them fresh ground to go attack all the things that essentially need to be changed. And then they love the new season that's coming, next as well, because it'll be, like a brand new, let's just call it spring in terms of actual season. So we will come out of winter and re-enter spring, and whenever we get to that phase, it's going to be a complete different personality as well. And so I feel like those things inside of the team do adapt over time.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. The cycle of a business, the seasons of a business, in industries, in different things like that, it's always going to demand, flexibility in the type of talent that you have, the type of people, that are there, and the skills they have to leverage them. But that's what's important, I think, about building high performing teams. And I think, why I said it on, uh, you know, my last, soliloquy there, which is about, you have to be willing to change teams sometimes, and that's tough to do. And oftentimes you see executive teams, I see, that are they developed contracts that are restrictive to team change. They have sort of had an over reliance on certain people now, that because they have an over reliance on them, now that person has leverage, and that person can actually be a disruptor to where the company and vision is going. So, there needs to be a constant evaluation of the teams, the performance, having the right people cast in the right parts of the play. And leaders that are not doing that, or leaders that expect HR is doing that for them, they're going to find really quickly that the strength of their processes, contracts, IP, things like that will not supersede the the lack of their team's performance. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I feel like, and that ties to me as well, to the third dysfunction of a team, that lack of commitment, right? The whole idea that the team has to perform together but also be committed together. And if you have people that have, let's say, outside influences or strengths that are caused by their contractual capabilities or whatever, that gives them an overarching um sort of agenda that's different than that of the success of the team, it can be a real challenge, as well, in terms of not just managing it, but just being a fellow teammate as well. So yeah.
Yeah, you certainly have to have that commitment. One method that I like that not a lot of people know about, and I think it's by this company called Performia out of Australia, but it's called the CART method. And there's actually, if you look online, you can Google or YouTube the CART method, and it'll has this great funny animation of this team and these certain roles that people play. So you have basically the performer. That's the person out front of the cart that has it, that's pulling it forward, that's setting the direction. Here, this is where we're going. That's a true leader, right? And they're really a part of the team. They're committed to putting everything on their back. Then you have doers. And doers, aren't yet performers. They really don't know how to set direction and stuff, but they certainly can help. So they're on the side of the cart pushing it, or at the back of the cart pushing it. So they're helping that performer as they're steering it and pulling everything on their back. Then sometimes you have people that are sitting inside of the cart and they're pushing on the wheel. So really, they're quasi interested. They're not really helping or hurting the team. They're doing work, but it's not necessarily good or bad. And then you start to get into the more nefarious roles. So then you have the sort of quasi disruptor. This is a person that stands on the peg of the wheel of the cart. So as it's going up and down, their gravity is giving the cart motion, so they're helping. But then as it goes up, they're disrupting. So this is a person that's kind of back and forth. They're not reliable. They change on their commitment and lack of commitment. So they're hurting the team and helping the team, and ultimately that's again, you're not helping the team. You're being a disruptor, then you're helping. So if you've ever heard of toxic relationships, that's what it is, right? People are nice one day, they're mean the next. That's not a good relationship to be in. And then you have the ultimate disruptor or the suppressor, and that's the person on the back of the cart dragging it, right? They don't want it to go. Maybe it's because they don't like the direction that it's going in, and things like that. But it's funny, any executive who actually takes 5 minutes, or not executive, any leader, look at your team, put people in those positions, because it should be performers and doers. You shouldn't have anybody else. Find your people that are quasi sitting in the cart helping. Make sure you set direction for them. Hey, you need to do more. You need to be more involved in this. And then your disruptors, the first one that's sort of up and down, they need to be put in check and quickly. And then your suppressor, the person that's holding things back, you get rid of them. You cut them because they're not going to help you. So you try to salvage what you can, but ultimately what you want are people pulling that cart and pushing that cart forward. You don't want people sitting in it, standing on the peg or pulling it back. And you could even think right now, I'm sure, go through all these different teams that you've probably consulted through your career. And there are those disruptors, right, that are up and down, that don't want this direction. So they're sort of sabotaging things. I've seen it with my own two eyes more times than I can count on hands with leadership teams. So it's a kind of creative, method that's a little bit off the beaten path that, if somebody takes it away, then, they can use it.
Yeah, there's I mean, to me, that I've learned something today. So thank you for sharing that. I certainly have never I haven't heard of that analogy before, but for sure I've seen it in action. And the one last thing that I would sort of maybe add to that as well is that in the moment where the cart has the most momentum possible, if you have a fully high performing team, I'll go back to one of the high performing teams that I was actually, pleased and honored to be a part of. I remember sort of discussing with like the teammates, like as we sort of started seeing more and more momentum in the things that we were doing. And for sure, we had done all the hard lifting early on, fought a lot of fights and battles that were bloody for all of us, to try and get one particular change in place for an organization. And as we were sort of gaining momentum, it was one of those things where, one of the teammates had come back and we were having just a small team discussion. What do we think would happen now if somebody were to resist and say no to this change. And I kind of likened it at that point in time to, and we could use your cart method as another, equal analogy to this, but I likened it to a high speed locomotive. Essentially just we had so much momentum at one point. I sort of had said, I challenge, pretty much anybody to try and stand in front of it now, because we not only had sort of won over a lot of the people that were resisting early on and kind of pulling us behind, but also anybody else that was sort of alongside and kind of coming along, as well as in the end, the most senior leadership in the organization. And there was just so much momentum, that I felt like, hey, look, this would be really hard to change. What then started to happen, right, is that naturally, because people would look at this particular change or us as individuals, we all slowly but surely got hired away to different teams. And so over time, that same change was vulnerable again to going back to the way that it was. And so I got a call, I want to say it was like 4 or 5 years after leaving that organization. And somebody had said, hey, remember all the things that you had done with regards to this particular time and cost savings. Um, what do you think happened? Because we're sort of going back to the old way that we used to perform. And I said, well, I mean, I know from the outside, I watched as you cut this particular thing that we put in place. That was instrumental to what we had done. You reassigned, this portion of the organization to somebody else that doesn't really care about what you're asking about. I mean, their level of care is in a totally different spot. And so they saw things just, quickly revert back, to something else. And, 5-year period may not be quick enough, but also, they saw this change enough that all of a sudden they were reflecting back going, wait a minute, we used to be here and now we're, back to where we, used to be. And how did that happen? Well, I mean, in part, it's because of the way that, changing out the team that put that in place caused it, but also just allowing those things to revert back also impacted it as well.
Yeah, no, 100%. I love I'm going to use that sort of the momentum of the cart, or the locomotive that you said, because once the momentum does get going, it becomes increasingly hard to disrupt it. And then those people that are trying to disrupt it, it looks very, very clear. And it's a lot more simple to engage them and get them to move with you or exit them, because it's moving with so much momentum that it can't be stopped. But like you said, if with change and things, sometimes that momentum can let up, and that's when you're not performing anymore. But I think there's this innate, like, palpable feel to a team that has momentum, right? That they have trust, they're performing, the locomotive is moving down the track, and you can feel it, you can see it. And sometimes I think, again, like you said, it's hard to articulate and describe what that is. And slowly over time, as people leave and things like that, it will lose steam. And that's why it's always important. And I think I said it before, maybe I sound like a broken record, but leaders need to be constantly evaluating the performance of their team. And they need to be thinking about it in terms like you just explained it, with that momentum. Do we have it? Is it there? If it's not, why not? How do we get there? How do we sustain this momentum? And oftentimes too, like you said, things come in seasons, and things in life are done in sprints, whether we like it or not. There isn't endless energy to just run ahead and keep going forever. You're going to have times where you've got a lot of momentum, you get a lot of things done. Some people leave, some of the energy leaves, but that's when you've got to reassess things, regroup, and then get that momentum back. It's going to happen, right? So again, leaders need to be thinking more deeply about the performance of their teams, how to build high performing teams and good cultures. Because one of the things we didn't touch on is, or maybe we probably have, but when it comes to the culture of teams and organizations, it only takes one bad actor or one bad thing to really throw a monkey wrench in everything, and derail locomotive that has a lot of momentum. Things like that are instances where you have inappropriate relationships where people get hurt at work badly, where there's some sort of a big falling out or a fight or something like that. So it's really important, for an organization that if you want to have high performing teams, there needs to be boundaries of what good behavior is, what safe behavior is, what inclusive behavior is, because that's the one thing that will kill a team as well. When you have somebody that isn't inclusive and they do something that's inappropriate, or when you are trying to push so hard, so fast that somebody ends up getting hurt in your organization. So I would say as well that high performing teams, with anything else, you got to make sure that there are no bad actors and that there are clear boundaries of what appropriate behavior is on those teams, because you see it permeate. Think like police departments is a good example. When the chief of police doesn't train, isn't educated on, yeah, the Bill of Rights, when they're having inappropriate relationships with officers, when they don't have a good inclusive work environment, what happens? The officers are typically the same way, or many are doing the same thing, and they're getting lawsuit after lawsuit, wondering why. Well, it's the guy up top,
Mm.
or his staff, or gal up top and her staff, that there's some bad actor that is influencing this awful culture. So again, I would always recommend that leaders make sure that there are no bad actors, and if there are, put them in check or get them the hell out, and quickly.
Yeah, I think the two things that I mean, and I typically talk about it this way. The two things that I feel like can really help, really damage a culture and make it absolutely impossible to fix, right? Um, One is the Teflon individual who, no matter what, the problems are never theirs. They're always everybody else's. And I've worked with a few of those in the past, and I mean, it typically catches up with them at some point, right? I mean, eventually somebody understands that, hey, look, I mean, at the end of the day, this person should have been absolutely accountable for this thing, and for whatever reason they weren't. The second one is certainly the hothead, and somebody that yells and screams and sort of comes unglued for things. Just those types of personalities just really are absolutely detrimental very quickly to a team culture, especially whenever you have it in a senior leader of any sort. And so those sort of things, I feel like everybody has to be watching out for at the end of the day, to make sure that um that they sort of deal with it and root it out, right? I mean, there's certainly are coachable moments in these things, and I don't think that you necessarily have to get rid of every single leader that shows any signs of this. But at the same time, you have to see whether or not if they are coachable at any level, because if not, there needs to be some sort of reckoning for that as well, because it'll destroy your culture. And the last thing I was going to mention, which also sort of ties to some of the things that you were just saying, is that as you have a team, let's just say whatever that team, and I've sort of explained this to teams that I've led before, that if you could envision it like our skills and capabilities like a water level. I want those skills and capabilities to continually only go up, right? And so when we think of, let's say, if there's 5 levels of individuals that are on a particular team, if you have threes hiring twos, or people that are fours hiring threes, that threes hiring twos, etc., your water level, or your capability and skill set inside the team only continues to dilute as you hire people or whatever. But if you set this sort of vision that, hey, look, we are only going to hire people better than us. My goal as a leader is only to find somebody that's better than me, that has skills better than me, and I'm going to go out and hire that individual. Now, all of a sudden, the water level continues to go up. You have to keep all the other things, I feel like, in mind, though, that you were talking about, right? That when those, let's just say now, maybe you used to only have, 1 through 5. Now all of a sudden you got sixes, sevens, and eights on the team, right? And because of that, those individuals also need to know that they're part player, right? I mean, hey, if we went out and hired, some star basketball player, some star football player, and they show up and they show up with this sort of, I guess, chip on their shoulder, sort of impression of themselves that, hey, look, I am the star. I'm the reason why this team's going to succeed. The idea that the rest of the team's going to support them is probably pretty unlikely, right? So the whole idea is that we're raising the water level, raising the skill level of the team, with the whole idea that at the end of the day that we're all better, and that should be the real goal of a high performing team.
Yeah, no, 100%. I see that a lot in blue chip companies that, blue chips are so rich that you can kind of get lost in some of those companies. So if you're somebody that wants to only, let's say you're a four, so you're only hiring threes and twos because you don't want people to come for your job. You don't want anybody smarter than you. You don't want anybody challenging you.
Right.
And yeah, you eventually that water level is going to be lower. You're going to dilute your team. You're not going to perform as well. But in big blue chip organizations, you can have lower performing parts of the organization and teams because it's so big and it's so rich that everybody pulls them up. So they can hide away and kind of get away with that for years, even decades. I've seen it. I'm serious. Where there's people in a job, you're just like, I cannot believe that you were hired and you're still here. But I think when you get into smaller companies that are in growth mode or startup companies, that will only last so long. I mean, you'll run out of money, your team won't perform, and you'll be dead in the water. So, if you're the type of person that only wants to hire people that are not as good as you, yeah, you maybe get away with that a little bit in blue chip, but you're not going to get away with that in a startup, in a small company. You need to hire the A players. You need to find people, like you said, that are better than you. I like that analogy. Raise the water level. Don't worry about somebody coming and vying for your job, because ultimately, if you brought them in and hired them, that's a great look on you. And even if at some point they get up to your level and maybe surpass you, so what? Look at what you did. You guys are all succeeding as a team. You brought in people, and now you're hitting your mission. So if you go somewhere else, not only do you know how to pick great people, you know how to build great teams. You know how to build teams that perform. Yeah, so what? So you had you brought in somebody that maybe surpassed you. That's a great thing. And it's crazy to me that there are people out there that really feel threatened about bringing in people that are, smarter than them or that will challenge them. But I think, again, it probably goes back to just a fundamental misunderstanding of what a high performing team is, and that person's more concerned with themselves rather than, the performance of their team. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Ron, I have a very direct question for you. Um, in terms of teams and working with teams, what are some of the things that you do currently as a consultant? How do you support teams, today, and how would you engage with an organization today, and where could people use you more if their organization is growing and they need some help?
Yeah, I mean, usually the way that it works is I work with CEOs, or I work with CFOs. I usually work with executives, and they bring me in to help them somewhere along the line, from strategy through execution. Something's broken, right? You have to have a strategy in a team that says, "Hey, this is the direction we're going. This is the decisions that we're making." It's not a plan; it's what the strategy is. Then you have to have a strategic plan. Okay, we're going to do these objectives, one, two, three. And these objectives are going to be measured by these goals or these performance indicators. Then you have to communicate that in a way, at every level in your organization. And ultimately, then you have to execute that. You have to provide the resources, the accountability, the detailed level planning about how to execute that. And then, most importantly, you need to govern that process, right? You need to make sure that you're checking in. Are we hitting the goals that we're supposed to be doing? And usually, as people bring me in, the first thing that I ask is, tell me about your team. Who is the team that we're going to be working with? Who is the team that is either going to be helping us create this strategy, create the strategic plan, communicate it, execute it, and govern it. Because that's what we do. That's what every business does. There's no other way to do it. That's how businesses function. And the what I help CEOs, CFOs, things like that, I'll help them understand, do they have the right team members? Because ultimately, if they're having a sometimes people will bring me in, they say, we have the strategy, we need help with strategic planning. We have the plan, the communication, and they do. They've got people excited, but they have no idea how to execute or govern. So at some point in there, the team isn't performing like it's supposed to. That's what a good team is supposed to do. It's supposed to agree on the direction that we're going. Everybody does their part. They understand this is how success is measured. This is how we communicate. We're all saying the same thing. This is how we govern this. So ultimately, there usually is some issue in your team if there's an issue in that process. And I help them find it. I help them understand and evaluate their team because ultimately, sometimes it's that simple. It's that simple that your problem is really you've got a great strategy. You just have trouble with strategic planning because your team isn't taking ownership of these objectives, or they're not committed to the goals in this vision. And you help them understand how they can coach those teammates and those people to get them to see that vision, to get them to have that level of ownership and to have that level of responsibility and accountability in executing. I mean, I've seen, Don, where we've done, okay, we've got a strategy. I've helped them facilitate so that their experts can put together the strategy. We've got a strategic plan. Here's the objectives. The commercial guy has this particular objective, but he doesn't want to execute it. He doesn't want to govern performance. He doesn't want to roll his sleeves up and have those tough conversations with his GMs, with his lead salespeople. And he just sort of wants to do the strategy thing and the strategic planning and talking to the board. And he doesn't want to get his hands dirty. I help the CEO understand that's where you have a problem. He's not communicating with his team. He's not helping them execute. He's not governing. And that's why you're not seeing performance in sales. Smart guy, knows how to strategize, knows how to help make strategic plans. But when it comes to actually getting his hands dirty, he can't and he won't. So that's what you need to rectify here. And that's what we need to rectify. So that's just kind of an example of how I help people and how team dynamics come into play.
And people can find you at Propellant Consulting, right?
That is right. They can find me at Propellant Consulting. They can find me on LinkedIn. They can, find me my LinkedIn page, Propellant Consulting. They can call me, email me. So yeah, I'm around, easy to find. And I have very simple conversations with businesses because really I just want to understand that process of strategy through execution. And then we look at those things, their teams, their resources, the current external environment, and we help them figure out what are those key bottlenecks. Let's unlock those, let's prioritize those, and you'll see performance start to happen, and you'll see your vision transform into results.
Yeah, I primarily, I mean, just for folks that are interested in also in engaging me, I primarily focus in on business operations and commercial operations. Um, and you can find me at improvingprocesses.com. The, several of the things that I feel like Ron and I both touch on is taking a look at strategy, but also how does that turn into real world work, right? How do people then go out and execute those things? So I wanted to thank anybody that's watching or listening, and thanks a lot, Ron, for being here for another Productivity Power Hour. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it was great, Don. Always love being here.
All right, thanks so much.
Take care. Bye-bye.